Hello, and welcome to the Discovery Engines podcast, a podcast about the people and platforms who are accelerating science discovery. I'm here today in beautiful San Francisco, one of many places around the globe that are leveraging new platforms and tools like machine learning to accelerate science discovery and develop new therapeutics to treat illness, or new materials for better batteries, or diving deeper into the fundamental laws of physics to better understand the universe. My goal for this podcast is to shine a spotlight on the founders and innovators who are leveraging these tools to accelerate progress in this field, and also to encourage openness and collaboration. My own background is in management consulting and design thinking and tech sales. One common thread throughout all of those experiences is a deep curiosity and a desire to make complex things simple. I hope to put those skills into use in the conversations that we have, and that we'll learn and have fun together along the way. And with that, let's get started. What might the world look like if we had wet lab AI scientists capable of driving groundbreaking new research? This week, I had a chance to sit with Cristian and Théo, co-founders of a startup called Tetsuwan that is building just that. In our wide-ranging conversation at their offices in downtown San Francisco, we covered a number of topics, including the newfound ability for large language models to translate scientific intent into executable code, overcoming differences in scientific language and managing bias in datasets, how to increase transparency and collaboration in the automation market, starting a deep tech company in the US versus in Europe, the safety implications of developing AI agents in the wet lab, and finally, and importantly, Théo and Cristian's shared love of Japanese anime, and specifically the show Astro Boy. Now, as we were sitting down to film this in their office in downtown San Francisco, all of our phones went off simultaneously, blaring a huge signal and a tsunami warning. Thankfully, no tsunami hit, but these two were as calm and unflappable as you might expect from a couple of startup founders. With that, let's dive in. Really grateful to be here with you guys, Cristian and Théo. So we met a few months ago in Vancouver at the Accelerate conference, and I remember hearing a bit about your idea, which at that time was in stealth mode. Since then, very recently, you've come out of stealth and are doing really interesting work in creating essentially AI scientists, I think starting with wet labs specifically. So I want to dive deep into that, but before I do, would love maybe if you guys could just share your names and your roles here at Tetsuwan.
Sure. My name is Théo. I'm the CTO here at Tetsuwan.
I'm Cristian. I'm the CEO here at Tetsuwan.
Awesome. So as I mentioned, you guys recently came out of stealth. I was reading your blog post on your new beautiful website, and it starts off with this Calvin and Hobbes strip, which I loved. And so in this cartoon, Calvin is tasked by his parents to clean his room. He's trying to find a way to get out of it. And the way he does is he creates a duplicator where he duplicates himself so that the other version of him can go and clean the room. And you asked the question in the blog post, you said, what would happen if we could replicate our most talented scientists indefinitely? How would the world change with unlimited access to their combined intellect and labor? Why does this question motivate you?
The way we see it, the scientific method is how we got here today. Like everything in this room, like these lights, that camera, like all the stuff over in our makeshift wet lab was given to us through the scientific method. It's led society to where we are now. Automating it with unlimited labor is how we will get to the next place the fastest. It's what drives us. It's what drives all of us. So any technology that can help in that process to us has an outsized impact. Like it's easy to see, thankfully, in like a lot of our early work even, our first system was deployed to a rare disease gene therapeutics lab. So to utilize this process to make new gene therapies or cancer drugs or whatever it may be, that's exciting, but it drives all progress. So I mean, there's no more impactful work in our minds.
Okay, so there's a real foundational impact here that's driving you. You talk about this vision of automating the scientific method. It said exponentially accelerate progress towards new medicines, therapies, and organisms, as you just mentioned. You said AI scientists will resemble scientists capable of not only executing based on the human's implicit scientific intent, but creating and executing on their own intent. What does it mean for an AI scientist to execute on their own intent?
Yeah, of course. Now we're diving real deep into it. Our focus is on the hypothesis testing part of the scientific method. So I guess taking a step back for any viewer that needs a brush up on their middle school science, scientific method, you start with an observation or a question that you want to ask, right? You form a hypothesis. Then you plan the experiments to test that hypothesis. And once you perform them, the experimental execution, you look at the data. Did it affirm your hypothesis? Do you have to iterate on your hypothesis? So the tools we're building are for automating the testing of hypotheses. But we see really exciting work that other people are doing, like at Future House, like at the Acceleration Consortium, Potato AI, in developing models that are capable of coming up with new ideas to test. We want to test the ideas, but there are other people in this exciting field that want to make models that create their own ideas to test. And if you interface the two, then you have a model that's capable of coming up with its own hypothesis, but also has a physical agency to test that hypothesis, just like we do in the real world.
Got it. Okay, so the scientific method starts off with generating a hypothesis, and then there's a whole process of testing it. You're focused on the latter half. Cool. So maybe starting off with just your story, what are your backgrounds and how did you meet to start Tetsuwan?
Definitely. My dad pointed out recently that I never say that I'm French in the interviews, and we actually have the French flag right there.
Hopefully that's in the shot. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm French. I grew up in the countryside of France, northeastern, and when I was 19, moved to Switzerland to study mechanical engineering and robotics at EPFL and ETH Zurich. I fell in love with robotics. This opened a few doors. I got the chance to intern at NASA. I was at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory working on the robotics and mobility section. I was part of a future mission to Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter. My goal was to design and build an autonomous underwater vehicle to go there and dive in the ocean of Europa and try to find traces of lives. It was super exciting, very meaningful. But I came to the realization that even though it was very meaningful, trying to answer humanity's big questions like, are we alone in the universe? Finding life on other planets is great, but there is life on Earth, this we're sure. And there are so many people here with so many real problems, and I wanted to do something impactful. So after finishing up my master's at MIT, I joined the startup incubator in New York because I thought building a company was probably something that was going to help me has as big of an impact as possible.
Okay. So I think that's one of the things I've heard, for example, that while we're exploring the solar system, we still haven't even, for example, explored most of our oceans right here at home. So you're starting with the real and practical problems that can have an impact more quickly and impactfully. Christian, how about you?
I come from the bio side, so Théo's a robots guy, I'm our bio guy, and it's funny enough that you mentioned the ocean. When Théo and I started working together in New York, that was one of our first ideas, autonomous robots to explore the oceans. So we were trying to cross over our backgrounds and see what problems that we could solve. My interest is really in the life sciences. I grew up in North Carolina, and I first got involved with research in life sciences when I was 17, back at UNC Charlotte. I was doing some genome assembly work with a grain crop called sorghum. And I know it sounds real boring to assemble genomes de novo for a grain crop, but it was like sci-fi to me. Looking at my beat up 12-year-old MacBook, running these scripts and seeing base pairs fly across my computer was like magical. I fell in love. And I chased the work to Caltech, and I wanted to go to the wet lab side. I saw the dry lab side. I wanted to use the tools that people were talking about in magazines like CRISPR-Cas9 and Rexer Genesis and all of these new amazing tools in genetic engineering. I got to work with the Wang Lab on a genome minimization project. We were trying to take E. coli and knock out originally 80% of its genome. Our rescoped project was a little bit more realistic at a quarter genome minimization, but it was amazing to see that a full genome engineering technology like Rexorgenesis would enable such a drastic restructuring of a model organism like E. coli. So we could do really crazy things with it, like use it to synthesize insulin, like it was shown at City of Hope in Genentech. But the reality of the work was a lot different, right? It's easy to love what the life sciences can do, but it's hard to love how it's done. A lot of time on the bench, taking care of your cells, a lot of pipetting, repetitive tasking. And I just thought it was like a waste of some of our brightest minds. I thought that science was brain power inefficient. We have all these people who are really good at coming up with new ideas to test, but we waste their brain power on making them test those ideas, doing the really repetitive work. So I met Théo, and it seemed like a natural fit. I had these problems. I hated the repetitive manual labor associated with hypothesis testing. Théo had a background in autonomous robotics. It was, for us, a match made in heaven. And then two, like the little pieces, the right time, right place, with these foundation models coming out with better scientific reasoning capabilities than ever, it was easy for us to spot the patterns. Pure coincidence, back when I was 16, my first programming job was developing some natural language processing scripts. So it all came together, right place, right time in Manhattan. We met Halloween, and I guess the rest is history.
Okay, wow. So what an interesting journey, spanning Europe, spanning, was it North Carolina, you said? And E. coli, and is it sorghum?
Oh, yeah, sorghum, yeah.
Sorghum. What is sorghum used for?
Sorghum is a grain crop that's a staple in parts of Africa and Asia, but we were interested in it because it has a lot of traits that infer climate change resistance. So our goal in assembling all of these different lines of sorghum was to contribute them to a genome-wide association study at Cold Spring Harbor to better understand the genetic basis of climate change resistance.
Okay, interesting. The genetic basis of climate change resistance. Wow, very cool. You met, there was this match made in heaven on Halloween to start Tetsuwan. I'm curious about the name Tetsuwan. You, on your website, talked about both watching Astro Boy, a show about a robotic kid when you were growing up. What is Astro Boy, and how did it lead to this naming?
Yeah, so when we met in New York, we started talking about each other, our personal lives and everything, and we found out that we were both watching this Japanese show when we were kids, despite having grown up in two different continents, separated by a huge ocean. We still watched the same shows when we were kids. Astro Boy is a Japanese anime from the 60s. Then it was again in the 80s and 2000s. It's a little kid, a robot. It's like the modern Pinocchio. It's been built by his father, and his purpose is to, defend Earth. So it's like a robotics kid, and we saw a analogy between Astro Boy, a robot defending the planet against evil guys, and our robot, our AI scientist, defending humanity against diseases. So yeah, we just I thought this would be a good name. The name Astro Boy in Japanese is Tetsuwan Atom. Tetsuwan means iron arm, so it was just a good fit.
Wow, that is so cool. It all comes back to manga. Would it be manga? Or is Japanese anime separate from manga? This is how ignorant I am about this space.
So I think the manga is the book, and the anime is the book that is adapted in animation.
I see. Very cool. So as part of that journey, after meeting, finding an awesome name from your company that linked you to across continents, you created this company, Tetsuwan, and recently came out of stealth. You've got some initial funding from organizations like 2048 Ventures and Carbon Silicon and so forth. So could you share more about just who your funders are and what sort of inspired you to kind of flip on the switch and go public with your vision and your mission here?
Yeah, of course. We're super happy to be working with Julie from 2048. They're leading our round, Carbon Silicon, Nishbat, and then also Everywhere Ventures. So we have a pretty good collection of people, and we're happy with our cap table because we've got a lot of scientists and biotech people. Like, they're specific to us. Julie Wolf in the team over at 2048, Sandra as well, they're incredible. Super, super sharp, like the exact people we want to be around. And then Nish too, with his work over at Color. So happy with our investors. We raised back in May, but we decided to keep things a little bit more quiet until we had something to be proud of, which is not to us raising money, but actually delivering something that makes an impact. After we left New York in January, the first place we went was San Diego, where we started working with our first lab. We recently delivered to that lab like 2 weeks ago, November 11th, however long ago that was. Thank you. But they're a group that had an interesting problem. It was a rare disease gene therapeutics group. They developed these RNA therapeutics called antisense oligonucleotides, which is just like too fancy of a word to say these short sequences of RNA that are able to go into the cell and find mutated mRNA and either bind to it right there and block it from getting translated in the ribosome or digest it. So it's really cool. It finds the bad stuff, and it's like a little genetic missile that goes in, finds the bad mRNA, destroys it. So these therapeutics can be used to target a variety of different diseases with a genetic basis, like muscular dystrophy or Huntington's. Really cool stuff. But the issue is that for that genetic missile to hit its target, it first needs to get into the cell, and that's a tough process. So researchers attach something called conjugate, which is like a molecular key that binds to a receptor and allows the missile to go in. But every single cell type is going to have a different set of locks and keys that work with those locks. So to find these conjugates, you have to do a lot of experiments. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. To date, there's only one conjugate that's approved by the FDA, GalNAc. We have over 200 cell types in our body, and we've only got one key for one cell type. We're restricted. So at La Jolla Labs, they had the idea to use automation to look for new keys. They paid some integrator north of $1 million to set up a work cell that was capable of sifting through all of these potential conjugates, running these experiments, iterating on them, choosing a new conjugate to find these needles in the haystack. But what they discovered is what, unfortunately, a lot of people discover when they try to adopt automation, which is it's not made for this type of thing. It's not made for high differentiation work. There's no cognitive abilities of these work cells. You have to program them in a very meticulous, rule-based way. So the program failed. They still have to rely on human labor, these really, really sharp researchers, to go and do a bajillion RNA extractions and qPCR plate preps. They're bottlenecked. So the interest to us was creating a tool that helps them find these needles in a haystack, or at least help them with part of their workflow, so they can rely less on their physical labor and more on automated physical labor to do this pretty hard task and solve a cool problem.
Okay, got it. Well, I want to get more into sort of the nuts and bolts of what you've delivered and what you're developing. Going back to your fundraising journey, my own background is in business, and I've got some friends who work in VC, and you start to look at the economics of a successful fund, and often it relies on things within a 3 to 10 year period really popping and creating a really nice exit that helps cover maybe some of the other losses within the portfolio, and the LPs and GPs sort of hopefully come out with a better return than they might get in the market. I think one of the challenges that I see is that in the deep tech space, often timelines are longer, things are more theoretical or capital intensive. Often they're selling into industries which themselves maybe don't have the same sort of competitive environment that you might find in consumer-based or enterprise SaaS, for example, where I worked at my last company. So could you maybe shed some light on maybe other folks who are in your shoes or might be in your shoes, also looking to do really cool things in advanced science? What did you learn from the fundraising process? What are either some of the challenges or sort of pro tips that you might have for folks who want to be able to really take a shot at some of these important problems like you guys are doing?
I think the most important thing to remember would be that this entire process, pre-fundraising and post-fundraising, for all time, for us, is just journalism. It's journalism with some engineering. You need to find out why people do what they do, what factors influence their behavior, why incumbents aren't doing what you're suggesting. Once you understand the landscape really, really well, then you understand how you can influence it. So even if there are fields like ours where maybe capital's dried up a little bit more, or there isn't the same competitive landscape you'd see in like consumer. Like if you have a good understanding of that landscape, you have a better understanding of how you can impact it through whatever you're building. Like we have relied on that heavily. We've talked to now must be over 200 automation engineers, scientists, lab managers to understand what the story is here, how we tell the story in fundraising, and how we can help address the problems in the story.
So what I'm hearing is the sort of key skill here is just being really, really good at understanding essentially the needs of the customers and developing a pitch or a product that has that really good fit, kind of like product market fit, as you're describing.
Yeah, and the government has a program for this too. The National Science Foundation runs I-Corps, which is a 10-week program, their national program at least, that helps scientists and engineers gain the skill set of an entrepreneur and helps them to commercialize academic technologies. And all they teach you in this 10-week program, well, I mean, they teach you a lot, but the main thing that they teach you is the importance of customer discovery and understanding this. Like they have this big 50-page workbook where you're just talking about these different incentives and how they interact, and the people up and down the supply chain and the different customer segments. Like that story and understanding it very rigorously is like the most important like first step.
Yeah, well, Cristian went through this program, he acquired all the skills, and then going through Entrepreneur First, like this first 3 or 4 months enabled us to really dig into this customer discovery phase heavily while being supported by the incubator. And so we dedicated like 3 to 4 months of literally just taking like calls with like people that we like reached out to on LinkedIn or like from outside our network, just like cold emailing, cold messaging, and yeah, trying to not bias them in any way, just having a good hunch, but then really like digging and pulling like the good product from the customer is really what we try to do during this. Since we started, basically.
Okay. There's a great book that I got recommended. I think it's called The Mom Test. Have you heard about this? Yeah. How to not bias an interview is actually really challenging, because I think one of the qualities we have as humans, which are good, is that we generally want to be friendly, and we're social creatures. And so we don't want to just give a thumbs down on an idea that somebody clearly has worked hard on. And being able to present an idea that you actually have worked hard on and not take it personally is also a really challenging skill. So it sounds like you guys have that top of mind. Théo, we have as you mentioned, the French flag and the American flag here. I saw a post, I think his name is Harry Stebbings, if I'm not mistaken. He has a podcast called 20 Minute VC, which he's had for a while, where he interviews a lot of VC folks. I think he's based in the UK. Recently, he announced, I think, a $400 million fund that he has raised in order to invest, it seems like, exclusively in Europe. And his whole thing was like, I'm tired of all of the kind of big news coming from Silicon Valley and the US, right? I want Europe really to help put Europe on the map when it comes to tech. Clearly, there's amazing research centers. There's AI startups like Mistral who've gotten in the news quite a bit. I think, in fact, it seems like our AI experts, even at American companies, happen to be European or French in particular. So I'm curious, what is your perspective as a deep tech founder? What have you observed about the U.S. versus European environment? I know you're just starting off here, so you haven't maybe had the experience of trying to found a company in Europe. Maybe you have. But yeah, do you have any kind of thoughts or maybe perspectives or suggestions for folks who maybe might be in Europe and are thinking about making a similar move as you have?
I think like Mistral and like all these like very big like foundational model AI companies are appearing in France because like France is very, very strong mathematical like education at the higher level, like at college, we do a lot of math, like very abstracted. So when people go to like the top school in French, they're actually very, very good at math. So that's why like these companies come up from there. But I think that when you're trying to build a startup, you want to put every single small advantage like on your side. And definitely when it comes to building a startup, building a company, hiring like talent, finding investors, Silicon Valley is definitely the best place to do it. So yeah, it was a no-brainer for me. I always try to reach like the best institutions possible. So that's what led me to Switzerland and the US. Just felt obvious that I wanted to get like the best, and I think to build a startup, like the best is in Silicon Valley.
Got it. Okay. So it's a really kind of the path of least resistance towards, ultimately doing something that's very difficult in and of itself. For you, it's being in the Bay Area and taking advantage of this ecosystem here.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. So going back to some of the nuts and bolts of, doing and automating parts of the scientific process. So on your website, you say, current lab robots require extensive programming by specialized engineers to replicate protocols, resulting in systems that resemble assembly lines instead of an assistant to scientists. Today's life science automation is only capable of achieving a high volume of experiments, not a high variety. And I heard something like that echoed. I recently did an event with somebody from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, also working in sort of smart automation. And he mentioned that either you have very kind of large-scale systems like you might imagine a car manufacturer that are finely tuned to a specific process and maybe quite effective, but they're very fragile, right? If you take a machine offline or something like that, suddenly the whole thing stops. Conversely, if you want something that's really kind of both intelligent and adaptable, those systems by definition right now are very, very small. It's hard to make something that is kind of large scale, is able to handle a variety of tasks, and that's also sort of robust and adaptable to things breaking or things not being where you might expect them when you're trying to pick up, a plate or something like that. So maybe, for folks who haven't spent much time in a wet lab, maybe played around with sort of the fun equipment, some of which you have in your office here. I see like an Opentrons, I think, Flex over there. Like, what is the state of essentially robots in the life sciences right now?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, it resembles what your friend at Lawrence Livermore had told you, where there are robots in the life sciences, in chemistry and materials. There are automation tools, but these automation tools are restricted to these like manufacturing-like tasks. It's high throughput, low variety. And we have to ask, why is that? So we try to use them, we try to set them up. And what we found very early on in customer discovery and later ourselves down in San Diego was that to set up these robots, even for really simple tasks, things for like kit protocols, they're out of the box, right? You have to convert the scientific intent of a researcher, the end user, into executable code, which is a non-trivial process. And the middleman right now who does that is called an automation engineer. Automation engineers do many things, but this translation of scientific intent to executable code is one of the big ones. And it is a real pain in the ass, because it's not even just things that we think about, like ambiguity in the natural language that we use to communicate experiments, which is a factor, but it's also things like, how do we translate our muscle memory for pipetting to a robot? Well, we know to suck up glycerol slower, right? Because it's viscous. We can't just go and move it. But a robot doesn't know it. It's agnostic to the viscous properties of any of your reagents. It doesn't know if they're heat sensitive. It doesn't know if they maybe even crystallize. So you have to translate that all. The pipetting settings, any ambiguity in the natural language, the labware that you choose, the way that you lay out the labware, like the tip logic, all of this stuff has to be converted, and we don't think about it. It's second nature to us. It's implicit. But translating those implicit instructions to explicit instructions is really tough, and the activation energy that's enacted by that really can only be justified today for these high throughput, low variety tasks. So a lot of the scientists that we speak to, even back at Caltech, my old lab recently got an Opentrons, and they can't use it for their work because of this issue. It's great if you have unlimited automation engineers, but we don't. These are super, super specialized people that get paid a lot of money because their skill set is hard to come by. They're a bottleneck in using automation for the life sciences.
Well, I think that's a good segue into what you all are building. And so, again, looking at your website and in our previous conversations, I see sort of two buckets that you're tackling right away. The first is what you're describing around translating scientific intent into executable code. So creating agents that can understand experimental intent, you say, is a foundational step towards AI scientists that can generate and act on their own intent. You also talk about helping robots carry out protocols more effectively. So enhancing these robots with automated calibration, liquid class characterization, and improved collision detection. So I'm a scientist. I should be able to speak as a scientist in my natural way and have a robot understand that. And then when the robot goes through its actions, it should be able to do that in a way where if things aren't where they necessarily were, or there's something in the way and so forth, it has the sort of, sounds like almost like device level intelligence in order to be able to navigate that. Am I accurately capturing sort of the two buckets that you're initially tackling here?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So one of the things that you said is like the timing of your company is such that, you know, there are new technologies that have come and been made available to you and to us sort of in society, in the market, that are, you know, making tackling these two areas sort of possible in ways that weren't before. So could you go into maybe like what are those technologies that have come online maybe in the past few years that like make your mission possible where it may not have been, you know, 5 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, the two buckets or two things we're tackling are enabled by the same like foundational like technology, which is definitely large language models. You're hearing about it everywhere, and like it's justified. Like before, scientists, if they wanted to translate their in scientific intent into an executable code, they'd have to, you know, go through like graphic user interfaces that are very like not flexible. It's everything hard coded. It's specific for one protocol, or they would have to write their own code in obscure programming languages that is out of their scope, and so it was like really difficult for them to communicate this scientific intent to the robot. They could maybe use like natural language, but before LLMs, good luck parsing, you know, like the variety of words and vocabulary that the scientists could use to describe the protocol. So, and let alone like the scientific intent, right? Maybe it couldn't even parse the commands. So forget about trying to understand the reason why the scientist is trying to do this experiment and coming up with suggestions. But this changed completely when LLMs came out, and especially it was very obvious to us when we were in New York. There was this release of a GPT-4 Turbo that not only can understand like the natural language and like the instructions given by the scientist, but even understand the scientific intent because it's trained on, you know, the scientific literature as well. And we were sitting next to each other in New York when watching this release of GPT-4 Turbo, and Cristian had this like very brilliant idea of taking a picture of a gel electrophoresis and fitting it into the model directly, asking the model to like analyze basically the result of the gel. And it was not only capable to understand what was happening, like what Cristian was asking, but it could actually come up with suggestions on what went wrong in the protocol, like understand the intent behind the experiment that Cristian was trying to run, and suggest modification to that in order to get better results. And that's what really opened like this door of like AI scientists for us.
It was pretty crazy to see. Like all the guys were messing around with it, throwing stuff at it. Like half of them were day drinking because, you know, their idea in the accelerator had been killed right in front of them. But putting in that picture of a gel and just asking it like, hey, I want to know if there are bands in lanes that match the anticipated sizes. Like Théo said, it picked up a primer dimer and it had this like multi-step scientific reasoning that this is a primer dimer. It's due to nonspecific binding, and your nonspecific binding is probably due to bad annealing temperatures. I know what you're trying to do. Get rid of this primer dimer by changing your annealing temperatures to this, and then try rerunning it. So, like the kind of undercurrent behind this entire field, like this advanced scientific reasoning, had pushed all of us to the same idea, which is, why don't we give these models physical agency to actually experiment in the world? And we weren't alone. Théo and I meet Halloween, and we're having this epiphany in November, but at the same time we were thinking this, a whole bunch of other groups were too. Co-scientists out of Carnegie Mellon, Organa out of the University of Toronto, ChemCro out of EPFL and RIT, all exploring the same exact idea, using large language models to operate lab robots in an agentic fashion to create proof of concept AI scientists. That was all around late last year. Future House comes online late last year. Acceleration Consortium comes online like late last year. So we really just see ourselves as being at the right place at the right time. The idea to the people at the intersection of these fields became really obvious really quick all at the same time.
Okay. So there's a wave of excitement and interest in the possibility that's coming out of these large language models that seem to be doing this like almost magical job of understanding scientific intent. I'm curious, you mentioned, I think, GPT-4 Turbo. Have you played around with the other large models like a la Claude and Anthropic, maybe Mistral's model, Meta's model, and so forth? And have you noticed any variations in how they understand scientific intent or their capabilities in doing that?
Yeah, there was a very funny story when we started in San Diego. It was just Christian and I. We just raised our 250K with Entrepreneur First. We were down in San Diego trying to understand better the work at La Jolla Lab and everything. We're in this tiny Airbnb. We were coding on the couch. It was one bed, one bed for us two. Yeah, it was just we're coding like that. And at one point, I hear Christian say "Oh, what the hell? I broke something. It's not working anymore." And the LM was just spitting out nonsense. It was not capable of doing what we wanted it to do anymore. And turned out by mistake we changed the setting to 3.5 instead of 4. So definitely there are huge differences in models. Claude 3.5 Sonnet seems to be working a little better. There are benchmarks and people try to do benchmarks of it. Internally we try several models. Basically 3.5, 4.0 is what we use at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. And for anybody interested, Future House actually put out a really good benchmark on this, I think back in July, LabBench. They kind of profile a different type of problem than we're solving here, but still are able to show the scientific reasoning capabilities through some cloning benchmarks of different models. And it confirms what we've seen kind of experimentally, which is that GPT-4 and Sonnet 3.5 stand in a class of their own. And all the open source models kind of are lagging behind in terms of scientific reasoning. But those two are kind of separated from the rest of the group.
So peeling back maybe sort of the magic that clearly OpenAI and Anthropic have bottled in these models when it comes to understanding scientific intent. From my understanding, they do a great job of sucking in a very large corpus of data, maybe more than others. They've got models with more parameters that maybe get them to have some better sort of, inference sort of capabilities or results. They also spend a lot of money on RLHF, right? Reinforcement learning with human feedback. Maybe and are or are not able to tell us, or maybe you can just guess, but what have they done that's enabled that capability? Have they gotten sort of lab bench scientists in front of computers that are clicking this answer is better than the other, more than the other folks have? Do they have a different approach? What is your hypothesis there?
I imagine data labeling is a big part of it. We don't know what they do, but we do know that they spend a lot of effort doing it. Back when I was at Caltech, and I think actually really early into this when we were in San Diego, OpenAI has a researcher forum, and they had been recruiting a bunch of scientists in the life sciences. So somebody from OpenAI reached out to people in my lab, including me, asking us if we would join this forum, and you get paid for doing certain tasks. That certain project was trying to, I think, profile the risk of GPT-4 and its capabilities of making or helping people synthesize bioweapons. So they were giving people jailbroken models or no guardrail models, and then seeing if that could help them make bioweapons. That's more of a safety thing than I think a scientific reasoning thing. But we do know that, they have a partnership with Los Alamos for the life sciences. They have this forum. They're reaching out to researchers. We actually got the chance to meet Adam D'Angelo, and asked him a few questions, didn't get a lot of information back out. But the interesting thing that he told us about this was that, there are the different strategies. You get a big corpus and then you get a lot of compute, but the corpus in the sciences isn't great. We have a huge reproducibility issue. A lot of this data is not the high quality data that we need to train really reliable foundation models. So his interest in this type of thing was that maybe we could be generating higher value, more reproducible data instead of what's scraped off of SciPub or anywhere else.
Yeah, not only is it poorly reproducible, but it's also biased. The publications that are published are always successful results, and like the scientists like remove all the outliers and everything just to make it like seem nice, which is like normal, everybody does it. But what you're running an experiment in your own lab, you're not going to get this like proper pretty data. So having a corpus of this information like gathered by robots deployed in labs is actually infinitely valuable.
So there's even there's a data problem in that the data that's available often is maybe slightly altered or sort of made to present itself in sort of this very optimistic way, but it doesn't reproduce sort of the results that you might see experimentally. And so having access to higher quality data is important.
In like a super simple example, because sometimes maybe somebody gets judgmental and say like, oh, why would scientists publish that if it, it's like perfectly representative of all the experimental data? Like we all do it. Like whenever you image a gel for a figure in a paper, you're not going to have it messy. Like you're going to clean out your buffer, you're going to make sure it looks pretty for your nice publication, right? But imagine a model that's only been trained on gels that have been imaged when there's a clean buffer and it was like a perfect pour, there's no bubbles, and you made sure all the bands were really pretty and dialed in the settings just right. I mean, that's not what it's going to look like if you make some tool to analyze pictures of gels. Like it's just not going to match. That corpus is not going to look like the experimental data, because we want to make sure that looks pretty, right? And this is a more innocent example, but it shows the conflict that arises.
Oh my God. Instagram has ruined us all, I think.
We have filters on their gel images.
We've made perfection. I spoke to a scientist a few weeks ago, and he was saying something similar in that when now you're looking to get funding, even in your proposals and I guess your grant applications, there's a real emphasis on effective scientific communication, which seems great on the surface, but often what he said is that it's starting to lead to folks sort of over-promising and under-delivering in order to sort of cut through the noise and get something that's flashy, something that maybe could then become published. And so we've almost gone too far in helping to, make science, which I think typically the criticism has been it's too dense, it's too hard for folks to understand. Maybe now we've made it not only simplified, but we've put all the filters on it so that it doesn't even resemble necessarily reality or what we actually expect. Interesting. So going back to the technology underneath these models, one analogy that I think of is, and we're in San Francisco. I'm amazed by how many Waymos pass by me every day. I'm seeing Amazon's Zoox starting to come out. I think they have like a self-driving one now in Soma as of a couple of weeks ago. And I think one of the sort of questions for autonomous driving, for example, is to what extent can you rely on these machine learning models, right? There's the long tail of sort of these things that might happen that don't happen often in maybe the training sets that these models are trained on, that ultimately are still very important to account for, right? That plastic bag sort of like floating in the wind that might look like a rock when you're driving down the highway, right? What do you do in that situation? One of the sort of other methods of approaching sort of AI is more symbolic AI or rules-based AI, which doesn't just sort of rely as much on large data sets and sort of like prediction, but more kind of hard-coded rules. How do you think about that tension when it relates to the work that you are trying to automate and sort of make smarter in the kind of wet lab scenario?
Yeah, there are definitely like trade-offs in that regard. The Waymo example is a very good example. You don't want to have a black box driving your Waymo and, like driving you into the wall and you ask, hey, why did it do it? And it can't answer, it can't give you a reason. Well, if you have a rule-based approach, you can say, oh, because this happened, like I turned right and I put you in the wall. But basically, we're trying to like mix and combine the flexibility of like probabilistic models with the robustness and the capability to explain the decisions of rule-based systems. The way we use AI to do this is that in the first place, we have AI parsing the information or parameters that are required in the rule-based. So you have the scientist speak to the AI agent in natural language, and the AI's role is to extract this information and fill it, and then like ship it to the rule-based systems. So you can like explain, oh, we did this because you gave us this information. The other approach is to have the AI augment the set of rules that you're using in your rules-based system. And so we're doing both. You get the AI basically to write new rules based on its knowledge of the literature and the circumstances of the experiment to augment the set of rules that you already had, so that later down the line, the robot can still explain why it did like this or that like setup of the experiment.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is kind of this hybrid approach between those two. What happens with, one example somebody in lab automation gave me recently was, if you have somebody who's got a protocol and it says, mix until cloudy, right? What does cloudy mean, right? My cloudy might be different than yours. So let's say a scientist says that. How do you handle that kind of potentially vague instruction?
It's a very good question. This is the core of what we're doing. And we very often use the analogy of the peanut butter jelly sandwich. I don't know if you've ever heard of that analogy. It's a very common in computer science, like professors use it. I recently found a video on YouTube of a dad doing this to like his kids, basically driving them crazy. Like the goal is to like tell the person, hey, can you give me a list of instructions to make a peanut butter jelly sandwich? And it sounds very simple, right? I was going to like open like the jar, like take the jelly, put it on the bread, and that's it. You have your peanut butter jelly, right? But this, the goal is to like do everything you can to like fail that peanut butter jelly. So you see the dad like taking the list of instructions written by the kid and say, oh, put the jelly on the sandwich. Okay, it's going to put like on the corner of like all around the edge of the bread. You're gonna
it's like it's on the sandwich.
It's on the sandwich. Yeah. It was like ambiguous. How do you get rid of ambiguous information, ambiguous instruction? And that's where the feedback is very, very important here. You can have the LLM like do a first draft of the program based on like the scientist's instructions, but then you need to show the scientist what this is going to look like to make sure that they can see, oh, I gave bad instructions for my peanut butter jelly. And this is also something that you can check not only with the scientist's direct feedback, but also with the LLM own knowledge. Like if the scientist says, oh, like I want to do like a qPCR, the LLM agent can have a list of rules that you've already predefined, or it can also look up like on its own like database, like using a RAG or searching on the web and coming up with rules and making sure that what it generated fits that list of rules. Those are like ways to make sure that this problem of ambiguous instructions is addressed. But that's definitely like the core of what we're doing.
Will there be a day where I'm a scientist and I've got an AI that understands my specific way of communicating intent and how that might be different from other scientists? Or are we all going to converge on the same way of communicating?
I think what we would want, ideally, in the world of science would be to all agree on like the definition of like each word, because you would clear all ambiguity and that would improve the reproducibility of all science. If you can have this like AI agent that needs to clear ambiguity in order to use a robot, then it means that any single person would be able to reproduce this experiment exactly, because ambiguity would be solved.
And people have talked about that for a long time, like a coding language for experimentation, right? Where it's just explicit. But I feel like that's what we're working towards. All of the lack of standardization is really, really tough to weed out, right? Because it's not just about the words we use, it's about how we store information. Like, scientists have a really bad habit of storing all their information in CSV files that are horribly standardized. Like one lab will do and store data completely different for the same type of assay in a different Excel file, and it's going to be completely different. Maybe even different people within the group are going to have their ways of how they sort through this. So to parse through it all is impossible. It's not even just a language problem. It's like a data storage problem. There's just a complete lack of standardization. So if we can leverage language models to bridge this gap, like Théo's saying, and create a standardized language, it helps a lot with reproducibility. And that's why specifically, we hate to say it, we'd like to say, robotic scientists, like tools for scientists, but where language models help a lot because they can help provide context to something. And it goes back to your original question about how do you know when cloudy enough is right? To know that, you need the context. What are you trying to do with the experiment? If you have that context, then it helps you answer the question. And it's near impossible for a purely rules-based approach to achieve that context. It doesn't know the context. It has no context. It's just following logical steps. But a language model can help provide that context to interpret ambiguity.
So you talked about the developing of the hypothesis, and then you talked about the execution part of it, and you all are focused, on the execution part. One of the other sort of challenges I've heard from, especially folks who've worked with automation engineers, who, as you mentioned, are, this scarce and very expensive resource, is that, the machines that are out there that are very expensive, whether I think it's Tecan or Hamiltons and so forth, they often are pretty proprietary and pretty closed, and maybe purposely so. Again, I put my business hat on, right? You've got maybe a relatively limited, market, a lot of R&D costs and so forth. You want to lock people into your own specific ecosystem as a way of just protecting your investment and, maximizing shareholder value, as they say. But that really creates headaches when you're trying to get all these different machines talking to each other and communicating, and even just getting all the data that they're generating, right? They talk about these kind of data silos and data islands. So I'm imagining that you are running into similar questions or challenges when you're trying to develop agents that can really affect science in a lab environment. You've got an OpenTrons Flex over there, which I think is one of sort of the bright lights at the end of the tunnel, right? Where they're trying to create sort of more open APIs and protocols executed in Python and so forth that are a bit more accessible. But yeah, what's the solution here? Is it more OpenTrons and then being really successful? Is it more collaboration within the industry? Is it some ways of reverse engineering how these things actually work? How are you thinking about it?
You summarized it very well in your question. You've mentioned all the points. I'm just gonna
okay, so we're done here.
I'm just gonna reorder them. But no, absolutely. The legacy lab automation industry is extremely opaque. It's very hard to use the systems like proprietary languages. Fortunately, recently, companies like OpenTrons or other manufacturers of certain types of modules came up with open API, open source code, good documentation. And that's the reason why we started using them in the first place. We started with that because it was the most easily accessible, and they've been very supportive of us. They've answered all our questions. Got to meet with John, their CEO. Talked with their automation teams. They're helping us on the delivery time for our projects. They're doing great, and I think this is a good way of solving it, having open source code and APIs. Unfortunately, it's still limited to certain liquid handlers, certain modules, and when you want to build an actual AI scientist, you'll have to get out of this ecosystem and go in the territory of reverse engineering, writing your own API wrappers, doing this integrator work that is necessarily evil. But that is, required. So we'll have to tackle that. But even on that side, there are efforts PyLab robots by Rick Weingrab, basically writing a wrapper around certain types of Tecan, certain types of Hamilton. The issue of opaque knowledge on lab automation is not only having opaque APIs, it's also just not communicating general knowledge about lab automation. There's only one forum that exists for lab automation engineers to come and try to gather some knowledge or communicate, form a community. It's labautomation.io, and it was managed by a single person, Stefan Golas, and we thought at Tetsuwan that we would support and fund this effort because we believe that this siloed lab automation knowledge is one of the biggest obstacle to accelerating research and discoveries.
And to put on the business hat too, there are people doing this great work in advancing open source materials, but you have to ask why is it so opaque in the first place? And like you said, there is some answer related to retention and how you monetize these high throughput systems or high throughput, low variety. Legacy lab automation companies, they make their money from selling hardware, but mostly from selling consumables and selling support contracts. you have these proprietary consumables on all these different platforms that start to get really, really expensive depending on what they are. Sometimes you need these black tips called capacitive tips that allow you to look at the level of liquid within a certain container, but these get really, really expensive, right? And you can only use that certain tip on that certain platform. There's some lock and key mechanism. There's some pressure check to make sure that the profile is right. So you can make a bunch of money if you have some CLIA lab running through 100,000 tests a day. You're just selling infinite tips, right? This consumable model works really, really well for legacy lab automation. The support model works really, really well. It's tough to use these tools. They need a lot of support. That support comes from automation engineers, automation consultants, the OEM manufacturers, like all these different groups, right? So this works really, really well for legacy lab automation. But when you try to expand outside of high throughput, low variety tasking, then this model starts falling apart. So that's why you see a lot of these manufacturers and groups stuck in like a local minima, right? Where their business model, their entire business model is built for what's done today, right? They're pushed back into consumables, they're pushed back into support. To do what we are suggesting means selling less consumables. High variety tasking is probably going to be a little bit lower throughput in some use cases. That means you sell less consumables. High variety tasking means you need less of a support bottleneck. That means you sell less support. It doesn't work with the legacy like lab automation incentives. But you got to keep your eyes on the prize. There's a much bigger market that can be targeted outside of what is legacy lab automation. This high throughput, low variety tasking only represents a hardware market of about $9 billion. Not much has changed in the past 30 years for lab automation. It's been kind of cannibalistic and not super innovative because it's a tiny market, like you say, and they have to come up with strategies to make money. But if there's a new opportunity that expands the use cases drastically outside of what's currently known, then that opens opportunities for the hardware manufacturers, for integrators, for everybody, right? It's a bigger pie for all of us. I'm going to steal this analogy John Bedell from Opentrons gave us. He told us, think about it like this. NVIDIA is one of the most valuable companies in the world, but they don't manufacture their own chips, and they don't make the downstream AI applications, right? They have their place on the stack. So current manufacturers, current people in lab automation have their places on the stack. They have incentives to do what they do. But there's a new opportunity available to dramatically grow the lab automation market. And we hope to be like a catalyst to go out in that direction.
So it's the business model, stupid, as they say. Yeah. It's the business model. And, you know, I think what's lacking and what you're, I think, getting to is that there are other ways of thinking about the industry that grows the pie, that incentivizes, you know, bright new startups like you to bring things to market, but might also potentially eventually change the behavior of some of these legacy organizations and have them sort of play ball and see the incentive in becoming more transparent. Great. So let's look to the future. As you continue to find new customers for your products, continue to iterate on the products that you have shipped and are shipping. One question I wanted to ask is from a safety and maybe ethics perspective, right? When we have systems that potentially are more automated and intelligent, that are working in highly regulated spaces. We're a couple years out of the COVID pandemic, and there was a lot of sort of fear around the impacts that obviously that had on global society. How do you think about sort of like what responsibility you have and others have in this field as they're trying to bring more intelligence and automation into the wet lab?
I think there's a short-term thinking and the long-term thinking. In the short term, what we're trying to do is lower the activation energy to wield very powerful tools in the life sciences. That could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing. I think in the long term, though, the kind of safety questions that we have to ask ourselves and people that we share this field with are a lot more dramatic. And they seem to be not pressing right now, but I might revisit at the end too, but I think the replicator is a really good framework for thinking about this, right? What if we do it? What if we are able to automate hypothesis testing in the life sciences for like this variety of molecular biology work? What if somebody's able to do it in materials? What if somebody's able to do it in like chemical engineering, right? What if we accomplish what we're trying to do? And what if other people are successful too? What if the Future House team creates a model that is capable of generating novel hypotheses? What if there are these downstream people that have really good knowledge distillation tools? What happens if we automate the scientific method? What happens if we have 1 million Hobbes working at Harvard, right? And I think the questions that come out of that scenario draw on some of the thinking from alignment, where it's like, oh wow, like we will have hyperbolic growth. What does that mean? How do we regulate it? Like, is that good? Is that bad? So short term, activation energy will get lowered. More people will have access to powerful tools. But long term, I mean, we struggle to think of something more consequential, something with a higher potential to have incredible impact, or a higher potential to have, potentially devastating impact. Like, this is the catalyst for hyperbolic growth that has been talked about in science fiction since Kurt Vonnegut in 1952 and Player Piano, Kurzweil, and all of these other people talking about how artificial intelligence will catalyze this rate of unprecedented growth. The way that we do it is automating the scientific method. So the ethical considerations that we have to take when pursuing the development of technology capable of doing that are significant.
And is there a model that you've seen or that you imagine that would be really good at tackling those kinds of ethical questions? Again, is it policy and regulation? Is it industry groups? What are your thoughts there?
I think the biggest thing for us is open dialogue. We know that this is something worth doing. We feel like we must accelerate our rate of scientific innovation in a responsible way. But that's not to say that there are not significant safety risks that should be considered. We don't know the impacts in full that will be had. We are not policy experts in every single area. So the best thing that we can do is, number one, think about this through a very responsible lens, but number two, be very, very open as possible so that other people can collaborate in thinking with us about the implications of technologies that work to automate the scientific method. This is something that impacts all of us. The conversation should be held with all of us.
Got it. So also thinking about the future, on the robotics side, there's a lot of companies making big investments in humanoid robots, whether it's Tesla or a bunch of others that are slipping my mind right now. How do you think about them in the life sciences space? Do they seem like a distraction? Are they exciting for you? What role could they play as they continue to become better in pairing with the kind of technologies that you all are building?
I think right now, their use cases are pretty limited to plate transfer. And that's getting real cutting edge. But maybe on the time horizon of 15 years, this will allow for us not to have these specialized tools like liquid handlers and other work cells and automation tools that are super bespoke, but something more generalizable. But that's a long time away. The form factors of today are evolved to do pipetting. A humanoid is not evolved to do pipetting. We were not evolved to, pipette, so we're not going to be as efficient with it. These form factors will persist for the foreseeable future, but maybe in the future, humanoids lower the activation energy.
Yeah, you brought up the example of Waymo, and I think it's a very good example to explain the difference between form factors and the relevance of using humanoid robots for that. The Waymos that are driving right now, they don't have a humanoid robot, holding the wheel and shifting the gears, right? Because that's not an appropriate form factor. When you imagine a future in 50 years, you imagine self-driving cars, they're actually here already. But you imagine in 15 years you'd have humanoid robots, but you don't imagine them driving the car, right? You imagine a self-driving car. And the humanoid robots maybe will open the trunk and take your luggage and do something else, right? And I think that's how we see humanoid robots in the context of lab automation. Bespoke systems, the best at doing bespoke tasks, and humanoid robots here to do the more flexible tasks that are interfacing everything.
Now I'm really disappointed I didn't have a humanoid robot driving my Waymo. That would have been so fun.
Cool.
All right. Very cool. So Well, we'll start wrapping up here. Before I do, though, so you had a big accomplishment in that you had your first delivery. You were in SoCal. I think we were texting when we were talking about this opportunity, and you were pulling, I think, some late nights there, trying to get things kind of wired up and working. What have you learned so far from that experience?
It goes back to what we were discussing earlier, the problem of ambiguity in like the protocols. We realized that even the best lab automation engineers don't zero shot a protocol. Like they don't just like read what the scientist gave them, come up with the solution, the code, the robot works like all like perfect from like a one shot. It's impossible. There are things that you can't foresee, even if you're the best lab automation engineer. The scientist with whom we were working forgot to mention one step in the protocol. It was obvious to them, it was common sense, but it wasn't written. And so when we implemented it, we had to figure that like something was missing. So having feedback from the scientist all the time at any point is like crucial. And so LLMs like allows you to do that because you can get natural language feedback and like translate it and like change your rule system so that it like takes it into consideration. So this or another one, like we had the Git C buffer that crystallized while we were like doing the experiment. It just like failed because the tip was clogged and it caused overpressure. It just like didn't work. We could have never thought about it. Like a lab automation engineer couldn't think about it either. So really like implementing a lot of feedback loops throughout the entire scientific intent to executable code like pipeline is what we knew, but are even more certain about.
Cristian, how about yourself?
I think one of the really interesting things to me, aside from what like Théo discussed in this conversion of scientific intent to executable code, was how we communicate our work and like the kind of user interface for this sort of technology. Like seeing how scientists interact with these tools and exploring issues like trust or the specific way that we word things and communicate this work and how it impacts how PhDs or these bench scientists perceive it was really, really interesting to me. There were a lot of like unexpected things. So, we got to iterate on the text side, but I think we also got to iterate on the storytelling side. Like, how do we tell this story to scientists that we want to empower them with better abstraction, better tools? Like, tell the story that engineers don't do calculus by hand anymore, right? We have AutoCAD tools that molecular biologists shouldn't be doing pipetting by hand. So, seeing the reaction and like iterating and having PJ at the bench and us reading out the website language, that helps a lot too.
So communication, feedback loops. I think in that spirit, and in the spirit also of getting rid of some of the opacity and maybe some of the zero-sum mentality that we might see in companies that are trying to make a buck and keep their employees employed in the life sciences space. One of my hopes for this podcast is to really foster collaboration and openness. And so one question I have for you is, where do you need help? What could somebody who might be listening to this, whether they're working at a large enterprise or in academia or an investor or policymaker or just interested and talented, what's one way in which they might be able to help you?
The biggest thing that we need is more young talent. We've been lucky enough to assemble a team from MIT, Caltech, ETH Zurich. It's like our team that will be able to iterate fast and push us forward. We need more young talent. We always will need more young talent. So if you are a young person who wants to work on an important problem, what we believe to be the most important problem, this is the place to do it. This is the place to work at the forefront of AI scientists. Real AI scientists, real tools that'll be used in real labs by real scientists. We are commercializing, we are deploying, we've already sent one out. Like, come work here to work on important problems. That's the biggest thing. But anybody who wants to collaborate, talk shop, whether they're in academia or venture capital or wherever else, if you're interested in AI scientists, we pride ourselves on, like you said, being open, right? Having an open dialogue, understanding what we can do best. So there's the website you can reach out at. If you want to talk about AI scientists, my number is 980-275-0807. Text me, call me, like we're here to talk. Our emails are there. I mean, we'd be lucky enough to continue to help foster dialogue in the community.
Great. And your website is?
Tetsuwan.com.
Tetsuwan.com. How do we spell that?
TETSUWAN.
All right. That was the final test. Podcast. Awesome. Well, Cristian and Théo, thank you for sharing your journey and the really innovative work that you are doing to push forward this industry for the benefit of the industry, but also all of us as humanity. So really excited about your story, the story that you're creating. I hope that I can check back in the future and get an update. But in the meantime, appreciate you sharing this time with me.
Thank you, Nabil.
Of course.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Damn, the hardest question was spelling the name. I really sweated on that one.
I had to think about it too. I was like, TETSU? No.